Hi, everybody. I'm Marie Berry. I'm an assistant professor at the Josef Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver.
And I'm Erica Chenoweth. I'm a political scientist at the Harvard Kennedy School. And our chapter in the Resistance volume was on the 2017 Women's March, its 5 organizational tributaries, and the challenges with translating a major march into a sustainable movement. So a lot of things have happened since we published our chapter. First of all, there have been annual anniversary events related to the Women's March with still impressive turnout, even though the 2019 Women's March was a lot smaller than the one in 2017. And there's also been some shakeups within the Women's March leadership. Certainly there's been some well-publicized fragmentation between different elements of the original Women's March. There's another movement that calls itself March On. The Women's March Board had a shakeup in July through September and changed its leadership and its leadership structure, it looks like. But they've had some broad impacts that Marie is going to reference next.
So we're just going to summarize 3 kind of categories of impacts of the Women's March. The first was in the 2018 midterm elections, where we saw many of the same sort of nodes and organizational structures of local Women's March chapters converted or sort of in synergy and in collaboration with local indivisible cells that then became a very important grassroots campaign and structure for changing many of the congressional seats that we saw go blue in the 2018 midterms. The second is in spillage domestically from the Women's March and the themes and ideas that were prioritized in the Women's March platform that have now kind of taken on movements, more independent movements or movements focused on particular issues, such as the climate crisis and the movement right now around the climate, such as the Me Too movement and the movement against sexual harassment broadly, such as also we've seen recently certainly a robust movement around gun reform. And just one more worth noting is the movement around family separation and against family separation at the U.S.-Mexico border. The third point is the global diffusion that we've seen from the Women's March. And we, of course, have seen hundreds of Women's March affiliate sort of marches all across the globe in the subsequent years since the actual original 2017 Women's March. But we've also seen women's leadership and women's important kind of roles in a variety of other campaigns, from the movement to remove Omar al-Bashir from power in Sudan to the kind of ongoing protests in Hong Kong, and certainly in hundreds of other places around the globe. It's worth noting that Erica and I co-founded an initiative at the University of Denver called the Inclusive Global Leadership Initiative several years ago, and I've been directing that initiative for the last year. And what we've seen is that every single time we've held some sort of forum or training or institute for women activists, there is just this tremendous flood of nominations and applications from all corners of the globe. We've seen people leading the kind of movement to end the war on the Korean Peninsula through the Women Cross DMZ movement. We've seen activists from Venezuela and from Nicaragua who are fighting to challenge the creeping authoritarianism in their countries. We've also seen people coming from Togo and DR Congo and Thailand, also women taking on these critical roles in challenging their oppressive government, but also demanding justice and accountability, peace and democracy in their home countries. And so what this with this movement and this institute that we've been involved with has really shown is that the Women's March is in good company, and that there is just no shortage of tremendously creative, resilient, strong, active, fierce women all across the globe that are fighting every single day in their communities and at their national political level to create more justice, to create more peace, and to create more democratic countries for themselves moving forward.
Yeah, so I think, one of the prompts that the organizers of this forum asked us to consider is what are going to be the effects on the 2020 election. And obviously nobody knows, but I think there are a couple of pieces of scholarship that suggest that protests can be tied to vote patterns and vote behavior. in important ways. The Tea Party has been shown, for example, to have come into power largely because of grassroots community mobilization, which included acts of protest in 2009 and 2010. Many people are now arguing that a similar dynamic took place with the Women's March and then other spin-off protest and organizational capacities in Indivisible on, as Marie mentioned, the 2018 midterm elections. And so the real unknown is whether the Women's March and now all of the other movements that it's affecting will motivate voters to turn out and issue a real rebuke of Donald Trump, whether it will equally motivate voters on the right to come out and defend Donald Trump. We can't really trust the top line public opinion polls, both because of the nature of polling and the nature of the distribution of power in the Electoral College, which many of the polls don't account for. So I don't think anybody really knows what turnout is going to be like, but previous political science and political sociology research has shown that we can often link voting outcomes to protest patterns. So if we continue to see large-scale mobilization and protest throughout the next year and a half, then previous scholarship would suggest that we would see that reflected in at the polls as well. On the other hand, it may simply be that we're in a different time, that the degree of polarization in the United States, the degree to which votes are suppressed, or motivation on the right is just as high as motivation on the left, then we may see something different from what previous research has been able to uncover before. So with that, I think that's all we were thinking about with this chapter. Did you have anything else you wanted to add?
Maybe just one final last note. I think one of the lingering profound impacts of the Women's March that we've seen already play out in terms of the discussions that the especially the Democratic candidates have been having in the debates is really the foregrounding of an intersectional approach to thinking about women's rights and women's empowerment in conversations about women's leadership, and certainly connecting issues of women's rights and women's advancement to issues of class and race and ethnicity and religion and ability and every other category and form of difference. I think has really helped discursively change the conversation in the national political space around women's rights, women's leadership, women's equality, and so forth. And I think that's an important discursive shift.
Absolutely. Great. Well, thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks.